Aw, I didn't want Merle to die, and I really am sad to see him go, and I'll explain why. The first part is I was hoping for a lot more to happen with his character, as far as being used as a plot device. The different interactions he could have had with all of the individuals at the prison would have led to a lot of interesting moments throughout the next season or two, depending on how long he would have stayed around. The first season is filled with a lot of great moments, but one of my favorites is when Merle's going crazy on the roof, before he's cut his hand off. He's dehydrated and a little delirious. He starts off by reliving a military moment, something we don't really know the story behind, but it's something where he is kicking somebody's ass or telling somebody off. Then he sees his hand and snaps back into reality and tries to find a way to get out of there, which the way ends up being to cut his hand off. My point is, that moment always was in the back of my mind as I watched this season, and it made me think of all the cool, for lack of a better word, things that Merle could do. The stuff between him and Rick alone could have led to some really great content. But that stuff never happened, and it's because of the more important reason that I'm sad to see Merle go. He mentioned to Daryl before about how he can't go to the prison, how he can't have a life there, and he mentioned to Michonne in this episode the very important line of him not being able to go back. Now, what he could mean by going back is to the prison because of, well, the obvious, him torturing Glenn, him delivering Maggie to the governor, him being an overall sort of bad guy. But one of the other things he did was attempt to kill Michonne. He took a team of 3 guys to kill her specifically, and though he was unsuccessful, that was his goal. And now he's sitting in a car basically confiding in her what the actual truth of the matter is. Which is that what he can't go back to is Daryl. He has ruined their relationship. He can't go back to being Daryl's older brother. Whatever he used to be, it doesn't work with Daryl anymore. Him and Daryl have both changed too much, and their situation, the world around them, has changed too much. He may have been picking on Daryl a little bit, at least verbally, talking about Daryl's balls and all that in relation to Rick having control of them. And while part of that was a distraction to get Daryl out of the room, what he was really kind of saying was that Daryl had somewhere else to belong to, and he was acknowledging that. In fact, the entire reason he even takes Michonne in the first place is in relation to what Daryl said towards the beginning of the episode to Glenn, that about how there has to be a way for Merle to make things right. He was hoping that somehow his giving Michonne to the governor would make things right, not between him and the prison, but between him and Daryl, to repair their relationship. But of course, after talking with Michonne just a little bit, because it was such a faulty idea, he abandons it and comes up with a different plan. And that plan, in my opinion, is one that is entirely self-destructive. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't a good plan and that his motives may have been in part to kill the governor and a bunch of his people. All that's true. I'm sure he wanted to do that. What I'm saying is that the plan ultimately was just another step, the last step, of a life of self-destruction. As Merle said at the beginning, he doesn't even understand himself. He's a mystery to even himself. And this plan was one of complete self-destruction, which is why it started with drinking a ton of alcohol. Well, not a ton, he drank less than a bottle, but that's still enough to get you drunk. Merle knew that he couldn't get his life back. The fragment of a life he ever had, he could not get it back. The main part being his relationship with his brother. So he did the next best thing he could think of and tried to make it right with a self-destructive plan that included not caring if he lived through it or not. And of course we know that Merle doesn't live through it. The governor not only bites off his fingers, he then shoots him in the chest, specifically, I would think, so that Merle can become a zombie. And that definitely was quite a touching moment, having Daryl sob like a baby, and I'm not making fun of him at all. It was very emotional. I don't blame him for crying the way he did. And then taking out his rage, so to speak, on his brother's corpse. Though rage isn't really the correct word, he certainly is angry, but it's not anger at his brother. He loves Merle, that much is obvious. What he's angry about is that Merle couldn't get it together, couldn't join him in his new life, with his new family, and that it ultimately had to turn out the way that it did, one way or another. And hopefully what this will do for Daryl is release him from the anchor that was Merle. It's sad to say, but Merle was sort of holding him back, ever since Merle had returned into his life. Now that Merle's gone and Daryl can move on, hopefully he can move on quickly because the war is about to start, he can go back to his next family, kinda his real family. As much as Merle was blood, he was never actually there for him. But the prison group has been, and hopefully that will be how Daryl handles the situation. And one other quick little thing about Daryl. When he was on the path to catch up to Merle and Michonne and came across a freed Michonne, I don't think when he asked her if she had killed Merle, that if she had, he would have taken retaliation against her. I think he would have accepted it, more or less. He might have been upset, and they may have had a little scuffle, but I don't think he would have killed Michonne had Michonne killed Merle. The only thing I have to say about Michonne this week is that, well, A, it was nice to see her have more lines and to become more of a character. I'm liking her more and more. But she made the comment when Merle said that they're both outsiders that perhaps he's right, and the look on her face made me think she believes that, but she still returned to the prison. She knows that's a group that she can belong to, that they're, unlike Woodbury, somewhere that she can take up residence. It's only disappointing that Merle's plan didn't work. Perhaps if he hadn't been drinking so much it might have. It's hard to say. But it really was a great plan. Drive the car that had a walker herd following it. A created walker herd. It wasn't a herd until Merle gathered them all at the car. That was pretty ingenious, and it worked pretty damn well. He didn't really kill any key characters, but he did kill that one guy's son, which... this is probably bad of me to say, but I'm glad to see him go. I want both those guys to go. And he killed what looked to be two other guys who were pretty capable. They wouldn't be capable and be there at that scene with the governor. As far as the rest of the prison group, there's a weird vibe going on that they're all preparing for their death, more or less. You first have Herschel and his daughters praying, and then Glenn proposes to Maggie, although barely, because tomorrow they might die, so they might as well be married first. It's sad in a way that they're so unconfident and so ready to die. Mostly because they're not giving Rick enough credit. He's gotten them through some pretty tough situations, and I think Rick will do a lot better against the governor and his troops than they might believe. And lastly, speaking of Rick, because we couldn't get through this episode without talking about Rick, there were some pretty major things, in my opinion, that happened with his character. The first being that I've decided his visions of, well, his hallucinations of Lori are his way of getting it together. Now that she's no longer in her white dress and she was in her normal clothes, I think Rick finally understands that he's on the right path. And that that's what the visions are, his way of coping with all that's happened and to try and make things right again. Not just for the group, but for himself as well. And getting it together, I think finally, is what's happened. And if you don't know where I'm getting that phrase, getting it together, it's something I'm quoting from Rick himself in an earlier episode. I don't know which episode for sure, but not the one after Lori dies, but the one after that, when Rick has his telephone conversations with Amy and Jackie and Jim. His fourth conversation is with Lori, and one of the things he says to her, in an apologetic sort of way, is that he couldn't get it together. And that always confused me as to what that meant, but I think it finally is starting to become clear towards the end of this current episode. At the end of Season 2, Rick made a big switch from acting like Rick to acting more like Shane, and that's continued through most of this season. Finally, at the end of this episode, he had a sit-down with his group, and told them that their dictatorship is over. It's now going to be an actual group again, an actual family. He, in essence, is the leader, but all of their opinions count, and he wants their input. And I think that's what his vision of Lori led him to. In summary, he's now acting more like Rick again, or is at least hoping to, and that is him finally getting it together. Had he been more of a sensible man, more of the sensible man that he used to be, Lori may never have died. That's a little outlandish to say, because she probably still would have. But the Shane in him would have definitely given Michonne to the governor. Rick, however, would never do such a thing, and I think he's finally going to stop being crazy. Now, I kind of hope not, because the crazy Rick leads to some awesome scenes, like him axing through a bunch of zombies in the prison. But there is a decent chance that the visions may finally stop.